Thank you for tuning in to Quick Counsel with Kristen Lavoie and Aaron Van Kampen, where we cover different areas of criminal defense law, but just a few minutes at a time. Today, I'm going to be talking about something I love talking about, which is guidelines, but specifically OV13, which deals with continuing pattern of criminal behavior. When is it scored? When is it not scored? But why the heck is it so tricky? Well, it's harder because it's so long. If you look at the rules and the statute itself, there's a lot of parts where it says score it now or parts where it says don't score it now. And so actually a good place to start would be just reviewing the statute itself, because it's going to give you a lot of guidance of times when you actually don't assess points under OV13, and then of course times when you do. So when do we score points for OV13? Just like any other offense variable, the first thing you should always do is figure out the category of offense that your client is actually being sentenced to. Is it a crime against a person? Is it a crime against property? And then check the rules and see if that particular offense variable, or here we have OV13, is actually scored for that sentencing offense. OV13 is assessed no matter what category of offense your client is being sentenced to. But that being said, a little trick is if your client is being sentenced to a crime against public safety, order, or trust, there actually are no points assessed for OV13, and you will find out why here shortly. But you know the sentencing offense, you know the category of that sentencing offense. And now we want to say what type of behavior or what acts are scored in OV13. Well, we're also only going to be concerned with felony acts. Points are only assessed for a pattern of felonies, not for a pattern of misdemeanors. And then we want to know what's the timeline for that. Is it all felony acts over the course of the client's entire criminal history, or is it only for a certain window of time? Well, it's only for 5 years within the sentencing offense. So knowing the category of the sentencing offense and knowing the offense state of which that occurred and looking within a 5-year period. So the good news is we're not scoring points for misdemeanors. We are not scoring points for certain offenses. But the bad news is actually we can score it if your client has multiple convictions on the same sentencing offense. Let's say our client was being sentenced to 3 counts of felonious assault. Barring some other limitations, which we'll talk about shortly, that would be 3 crimes against a person. Let's say they all occurred within 5 years. That's going to give your client points for a continuing pattern of criminal behavior, even though all of the accounts came out of the same sentencing offense. It can also be assessed points when your client had counts that were dismissed as part of a plea agreement, or if there were uncharged counts. However, you're not going to score points if your client was acquitted of that behavior. So we're looking at felony behavior, felony count offenses that occurred within 5 years of the sentencing offense, including the sentencing offense, if they resulted in a conviction or if they did it but not acquitted conduct. Where else where we might be able to object and say, hey, you shouldn't score points under OV13? Well, the biggest one, and this is one that has been scored incorrectly quite a bit recently, is the whole idea behind OV13 is to score points for a pattern of conduct in a certain category of offense. So we're only looking at offenses that are in the same category as your client's sentencing offense. Prime example, let's say the client is being sentenced to felon in possession, crime against public safety. But within that 5-year period, they had a crime against a person in that it was resisting and obstructing. They had a felonious assault. They had assault with intent to do great bodily harm. Those would be 3 felony offenses within a 5-year period. But they're not going to get your client points for crimes against a person because your client's current sentencing offense is a crime against public safety. And they give you an example of that right in the directions. I'll give you one more example, and it's because one that the probation department has been scoring incorrectly recently. Let's say your client had been charged with racketeering and say 3 counts of crimes against property, but those property offenses were all dismissed, and your client is there being sentenced only to racketeering, which is a public safety offense. There will actually be no points assessed under OV13 for those dismissed counts because racketeering is a crime against public safety, and the directions only give points for things like 3 crimes against a property, person, and so forth. So in that circumstance, even though dismissed counts can sometimes count under OV-13 if they're not part of the same category as your client's sentencing offense, the client will not be assessed points there. Also, you don't assess points that were already assessed for offenses in OVs 11 and 12. And let me back up just a little bit. That's going to be for offenses that were committed after April 1st, 2009. And let's say we have a client that has had other offenses or other criminal activity that you might want to score in OV-13, but it fits in the category of either OV-11 or OV-12. You cannot score it in OV-13. We start with OV-11, which gives points for penetrations under limited circumstances. If you can assess points in OV-11, you must do so. And if you can't, then you go to OV-12. If you can assess points there, you must do so, but if you can't, then you go to the analysis of OV-13, except for gang-related activity. So you want to make sure that, say, for example, the court or the prosecutor isn't holding off to assess points on OV-13 when those points could and should have been assessed under either 11 or 12 first. And another little nuance of OV-13 deals with offenses involving controlled substances. Let's say your client is charged with conspiracy to deliver heroin and also a count of delivery of heroin, but it's all for the same amount of heroin. Your client's not going to get assessed points for a continuing pattern of criminal behavior for one batch of heroin that happens to support multiple counts. So if you have a client with a controlled substance offense, just make sure your client's not getting assessed points for a continuing pattern of criminal behavior for one specific amount of that controlled substance. I hope that this was helpful for you in figuring out some of the nuances of OV-13. But if you are having more questions about guidelines, you can always reach me at klavoy@waynecountymi.gov. You can find CLE eligible training videos and more by going to www.waynecounty.defendertraining.com or scanning the QR code on your screen.